Hello and welcome to week 5 of Self-Identity and Agency. This week we are doing a couple of pretty significant things within the more general logic of this course. We begin by looking at social class as the first of our focused topic areas. So you may recall that our emphasis over the last few weeks have been to explore different theories that seek to tell a universal story of humanity and humanness by burrowing in to supposedly reveal some kind of essence about who we are in the world. The aim was always to tell a story in that sense that was applicable to all people everywhere and sought to universalize the experience of humanity by emphasizing the ways that we are the same. Our focus from this week on is to really start to explore, the flip side of that argument and to pick up on the ways that we are different. Social class represents an interesting context for doing that because at its very core, it is a relational idea. Now, how we understand the nature of those relationships is something to be discussed and debated and to be analysed. But at this point, I think it's just worth noting that and keeping that in mind as we work through this material. So our learning objectives this week is to explore the complexities associated with the idea of social class. So initially that will be about grappling with how we define the concept and pointing to some of the different traditions and efforts to do just that. I want to then take it from that historical account into the contemporary age, and in particular into an Australian context for thinking about new ways of exploring social class, and in particular through the experience of inequality. Inequality and poverty, as we'll see shortly, provide a really powerful context for thinking about a society where income and resources are distributed unevenly, and it gives us some tools for understanding those inequalities and the consequences of them more generally for ideas of identity and life opportunity. So I think bringing this into an Australian context is also helpful because what we're looking to do here is to use these ideas from the course to filter our own experience of the world. There's nothing stopping you, obviously, from taking these ideas outward and thinking about other cultures and societies. But I think there's some merit to looking at and thinking about how class is understood in this country. So I think many people have a sort of intuitive understanding of what it is we mean by class. I think some would even, perhaps reluctantly, some would be very forceful, but cautiously be able to say, yes, I'm part of this class group, whether it be the working class or the middle class or some understanding of the upper class. But I think what's also important in thinking about class is that we use this marker to position other people in relation to ourselves. And when we meet people for the first time, perhaps consciously, perhaps subconsciously, we're prodding or sort of sending the feelers out to try to get a sense of this new person's relative location in relation to us. So I think it's useful to sort of ponder this question, or these two questions. If you're only able to ask one question that should be, to determine a person's social class, what would you ask and why? So what would you ask them to figure out where they fit within the class structure, however that idea is understood? The obvious question, and the one I hope you wouldn't ask, is to say, hey, what social class are you? But I think for many people, it would be a question along these lines. What do you do for a living? For some of us, many of us perhaps, this is a daunting question. There are others who I would imagine love being asked this question. But for many, it can be a daunting or challenging experience because whatever comes out of your mouth after you're asked, what do you do for a living, you just know that that person asking the question is going to be beginning a process of locating you within this broader social system or social structure. And I think the what do you do for a living question also provides an insight into how we think about society and how we locate and identify people in terms of what we see, or many of us, I can't generalise, as this sort of key determinant. In other words, finding out someone's occupation, many would suggest, gives us an insight or allows us to make hunches about, say, where they went to school, perhaps even the suburb they live in, their general sort of tastes and dispositions. So, for example, if someone says, I'm an architect, or I'm a bricklayer, or I'm a neurosurgeon, or I'm a librarian, dog groomer, whatever it might be, is giving us clues. And these clues cluster together to perhaps begin this process of fleshing out the person we're coming in contact with, but also, again, this challenge of identifying their relative class position. But like we will see pretty much in every week in this course, there are also some real significant problems or challenges in definition. One of the reasons for this when we talk about social class is that the word itself comes from quite different, or gets used in quite different theoretical approaches or research traditions. So most of those traditions, and we'll look at a couple of them in a moment, would agree that class is a relational idea, so it's only made sense through contrast and comparison to other people. What they tend to differ on is the nature of those relations. Some, for example, will very much think of it as relations built on conflict and exploitation. Others will focus on consensus and shared understandings or shared or group beliefs. I'm not going to try to make an argument about why one of these perspectives is necessarily any better than any other one, but I think it's useful to get into a space where we can start to see the underlying logic of these theoretical traditions and how that in turn influences how we think about this idea or think about ideas like social class. I think what we will also see, and we've already begun thinking in a general sense about ideas like intersectionality. So intersectionality is this experience of the world where we group together different identity markers and think about the ways that they come to reinforce one another, compounding a sense of potentially disadvantage, but also privilege. And adding class to the mix is often a useful way of, again, sort of thinking about those processes too. So as we'll see in coming weeks, experiences of sex and gender, ethnicity, like we talked about last week, if we start to then think about how these relate and how they interlock or potentially sit uncomfortably with one another, it can be a useful way of, as I said, adding complexity to the story. So I've hinted at there being these different traditions. Let's just spend a moment talking about what that looks like or how we might think about this in general. I think grouping these together and thinking about the often disparate ways they understand class, I think there's a few key perspectives that we can think about or identify in this rich history of research and analysis. One of them is to understand class from a subjective position. So how people locate themselves within a class structure. So this is that question of, I am a member of this group or that group or whatever. So it's actually asking people to reflect on their own sense making and their own relative position within that system. So that's from a subjective position. Objectively is another way of thinking about it. So where are people objectively located within distributions of material goods? So the insight there is that, and I hope this is no great surprise to anybody, we live in a world and in a society where resources and opportunities are unevenly distributed. And there are consequences that come from that. Now, those consequences or implications can be complicated, but they're there nevertheless. So thinking about how that uneven distribution of income, wealth, resources, and the rest of it impacts our experience and our ability to negotiate social systems is something that we're going to be coming back to quite directly in the second half of this lecture. So from a subjective experience, from an objective experience, but we can also think about this politically. So instead of simply trying to tell a story, there is another tradition that seeks to actually explain inequalities in economic life and those differences and the consequences of living within those kinds of differences. And this very much locates us in that Marxist tradition, that, it's not enough to tell a story, you're actually trying to advocate for change by identifying potentially those tensions or flaws or exploitative sort of impulses within this society. So different questions represent different research traditions, as I said, and in turn very different ways of thinking about social class. So let's just spend a moment sort of going through some of these. I should also say that some of the accounts we're going to be looking at now are very complex. They're very often contested, so that there is disputes and debate within these traditions about how we should be applying these ideas. So all we are doing here is presenting a really general sort of thumbnail sketch. I'm not aiming for incredible detail, but more to get us into a position where we can see similarities and differences between these traditions, and perhaps how we can then take some of these ideas to think well about our own experience of class, our interviewees' experience of class, and how we might think of the construct more generally across our society at large. So classical approaches to class, the person who very much put this idea on the agenda and continues to have a significant influence on how many of us think about social class, comes from the work of Karl Marx. So for Marx, a person's social class, so their relative position in the system, is determined by their relationship to the means of production. So this is primarily an economic understanding of social class, and it's an emphasis on economic relationships that here, as it hopefully makes clear, determines your class position. While there can be other factors that might be influencing your experience of the world, from Marx's initial position, it's all about the economics. If you want to understand class, you have to understand economics and economic relationships. So in a capitalist system, from Marx's initial sort of take on this, there are two main classes. There are others, but there are two big ones that define and give shape to this system. On the one hand, we've got the bourgeoisie. So these are the owners of the means of production. So these are the people that own the factories, the businesses, contain and control the flows of investments and the like. And then there is a much larger group, the working class or the proletariat, who essentially exist by selling their labour in this capitalist system. And it's the relationship between these two groups that for Marx defines the experience of a class-based society. His argument, in effect, is that the structure of the capitalist system itself means that the owners of the means of production will necessarily exploit their workers because profits arise from workers producing more than they are paid. and they call that the surplus theory of labour. So let me just dwell on that for 1 minute. So what Marx is saying here is that it is your relative position in this economic system that defines your class relationship. And that in a capitalist system, from Marx's perspective, it is defined by exploitation. That for capitalism to work, it needs exploitative relationships. So that's there's some important things to take from that, because from Marx's perspective then, this is not about the evil factory owner or the virtuous member of the working class. Your position is not somehow defined by some essence you possess or some sort of key quality of you as a group. But again, it's about your relationship to or in this series of economic relationships. So because this is a system based on exploitation and it requires that exploitation in order to sort of function, what Marx then builds a theory around this idea is, well, why doesn't it just collapse? Why doesn't the exploitative nature become so apparent that people just back away from it? Or is it just so it becomes so exposed that these flaws within the system become so inherent that why wouldn't it just become so self-evident that it is, in fact, doing over the vast majority of the population? From Marx's perspective, what he then goes on to argue is that what we also see built around this capitalist sort of kernel of production are these vast systems of ideology. So we talked about ideology a few weeks ago, big worldviews that tell a story about where people fit and how the world works more generally. So we have big ones like nationalism, religion, consumerism, and the rest of it. And from Marx's perspective, what these things do is that they point or they obscure the exploitative nature of these relationships. So nationalism, for example, doesn't allow workers, from Marx's perspective, to see how that they're sort of involved in these exploitative relationships, but instead treats the workers and the bosses and everyone else as being part of this shared collective, your national identity. And that national identity then is used to tell a story about some sort of shared experience of the world that overcomes or is more meaningful or powerful than those inherently exploitative relationships of economics. So from Marx's perspective, this idea of class consciousness, of understanding and the willingness to sort of then challenge and break down this exploitative system will only become realised when the working class are able to see the true nature of this system that by design is meant to exploit them, but to pacify them at the same time, to keep them playing along. So that's Karl Marx's perspective. Let's look at another one from the German sociologist Max Weber. So Weber has had a probably less well-known than Marx, but a really significant influence in shaping how we think about these ideas. And again, if you think of Pierre Bourdieu, who we looked at last week, and his attempt to sort of move away from that Marxist tradition, hopefully you can start to see how Max Weber's work then provided that sort of alternative account that Bourdieu took again in another direction, but from Weber's perspective. So his understanding of social class or social stratification, more explicitly, was again a response to this Marxist tradition and also an attempt to break open the economic argument that Marx was making. So where Bourdieu last week opened up and expanded the idea of capital by making distinctions between economic, social and cultural capital. Weber does something similar by sort of thinking about economics, but trying to locate that within more general social phenomena. So for what Weber argued was that there are three dimensions to this structure that in effect worked to distinguish class groupings from one another, but also to provide an insight into how these kind of systems reproduce themselves over time. So Weber says there is first wealth. So this is what we think of in terms of the ownership of land or property, factories, assets more generally. So the direct resources that you can lay claim to, and obviously in the kind of world of 19th and 20th century Europe, these are very still resonate deeply with how people understand things. So we've got wealth on the one hand, then, according to Weber, we've got prestige. So again, this is the idea of social status or influence that a person is understood as possessing by others. So my prestige is only meaningful in relation to other people acknowledging that prestige. And thirdly, more sort of behind the scenes, is this idea of power and the kind of relationships or resources that a person can use to get what they want. So what Weber is doing here is sort of thinking about the way that you can carve a social world or a society up into different ways. He's drawing our attention, like Marx would, to money and wealth and the way that gets translated into influence, but he's also pointing to experiences of prestige and status and this murky world of power as well beneath this sort of process. So again, in these two traditions of Marx on the one hand and Weber on the other, we're starting to get the beginnings of a really influential set of theories or perspectives for thinking about social class. In Australia, from its beginnings of its white history, there's also been a story of social class. Australia is a country that has long spoken about class in often quite sentimental ways. So Australia has had these stories where it's been called the sort of working man's paradise, where organised labour has had a significant influence over the shaping of society and the opportunities for social mobility, so movement that have come from that. And the argument goes, so not critiquing it just yet, we're just outlining it. So the argument goes that Australian society has been able to overcome a lot of the challenges that the European compatriots have experienced by creating particular social or developing particular social reforms and social systems that have significantly influenced people's experience of the world. So the argument goes that our education system enables social mobility, so that if you work hard and work your way up through the system, you can use your education and training to improve your lot in life, and that there is a mobility that comes with education. We have a social welfare system that protects our most vulnerable. So from the very beginnings, as I said, of the late 19th and early 20th century, Australia did a lot to develop its welfare system. In many ways, it was remarkably progressive in terms of who it targeted and the nature of its assistance. But there are problems with that too, and we'll return to those in a moment. We had a political system, as I said, that acknowledged and protected workers' rights. So from a workers' perspective, the Australian Labor Party and the influence of the union movement more generally has been a consistent part of the story of Australia. And the argument goes that we have this more general sense of a fair go, so this idea of egalitarianism and sort of corresponding expressions of fairness and equality that were said to sort of give the system or the society itself a particular ethos or a particular sort of set of characteristics. So in effect, all of these things together were said at the time, well into the 20th century by many people, that it would allow Australia to soften the impact of this exploitative class-based system that many Australians saw, whether it be in the UK or Germany or France or wherever, with something that was unique, distinct, and that was thoughtfully designed. So one of the, as I mentioned a moment ago, one of the characteristics of this system was that social welfare became an important way of offering a safety net for the vulnerable in our society. So while this was a society that very much talked about equality and fairness, social supports, and the rest of it, it was also one, and arguably continues to be one, that makes absolutely razor-sharp distinctions between deserving and the undeserving poor. So from the very beginning of the Australian welfare system, there were all sorts of mechanisms in place to separate the deserving, so those worthy of support and assistance, from the undeserving, those that you would simply remove that to either teach them a lesson, but also to send a signal to the rest of society as well. So this deserving, undeserving distinction is something that has also featured for a long time in the Australian approach to social class, and we see that also being represented in within classes themselves. So the union movement in this country has long made, or historically speaking, long made a distinction between, or carved out a special place for the respectable working class. So these were people who were sober, politically engaged, and dynamic sort of and important contributors to the society at large. So even within the working class movement itself, you get a sense of these distinctions between deserving and undeserving being made. What's important to take from this, and hopefully the complexity of this starts to become clear as we move forward, is that this is very much, or was as much, a moral distinction as it was an economic one. So this could be something that could be taken away, and the power to label somebody as deserving or undeserving became a really clear and forceful way of, again, grouping and regrouping different members of society. What this also reflected was another very Australian thing when it comes to welfare provision, was this idea of the kind of messages and systems of incentives and disincentives that came out of this welfare tradition. And what that led to was this sort of, I said fanatical, and that sort of gets somewhere close to this insistence that that support to one group should never be used as an incentive or disincentive for people on the rung below them. So in other words, welfare support should never, like the logic of this was that welfare support should never provide an incentive not to get a job. Or to flip that around, the experience of welfare support, almost by definition, needs to be worse than the lowest paid or the lowest experience of participating in the workforce. So think about that for a second. So again, this is about telling a story, again, about deserving and undeserving, about creating systems of incentives and disincentives so that work becomes the way out, or the way of addressing most social problems. Welfare supports are there for people who stumble and fall, but the experience in the Australian tradition is that they get you up and running, and then you're climbing the ladder again. So as one of our previous ministers for social security said, it's a safety net, not a hammock. So in other words, it's temporary. It's not meant to be comfortable. It's a way of temporary, quick support, but the expectation is you're getting back into the labour market. So this idea of work, what do you do for a living, this sort of stigma that potentially comes with your answer to that question, again, fits into this model of how do you create a system where people want to sort of climb that ladder to success, want to participate and to become active members of this process. So that was a story about 19th and early 20th century understandings of these ideas. We've got an idea there of class emerging that is very much in the Australian tradition connected to work, probably not always understood through the Marxist lens, but very much understood about your relationship to the labour market more generally. And that question, what do you do for a living, then became a key sort of point of differentiating one person or one group from another. In the 1970s, academic research, so we're talking also about different research traditions, research and interest in social class shifted then from, as I said, the consequences or outcomes of living in a class-based society. So what does it mean if we acknowledge that there are different classes in, say, Australian society? What does it mean to live in these different groups? How is your relative position enabled or constrained your ability to move around, your social mobility, or however that might be understood? In practice, there was two developments that came out of this. The first was an interest in ideas of poverty, and in particular attempts to calculate the number of people living in poverty by developing a poverty line. So in Australia and in many other countries, this was a highly controversial and contested idea. And partly that controversy or the nature of that contest came about because of different understandings of, like class, different understandings of how we should think about poverty. On the one hand, so you have debates about absolute or relative measures of poverty. So an absolute understanding of poverty would be a person who is struggling to survive in any country in the world at any given time. So absolute poverty can be about measures of how many calories does a person need in order to survive? What are the minimum requirements for shelter and access to clean water and all the rest of it? What is the basic level of income or purchasing power that a person would need in order to be able to eke out a living? So an absolute understanding of poverty is one that is applicable, as I said, to any location at any given time. Relative measures of poverty were to think of it as a relative idea, so that what resources, what access, what supports do you need to be able to live a meaningful life in a particular kind of society? So Australia, where for many people, not all, but for many people, the question of basic survival, of having enough food and shelter is fairly assumed. What then do you need on top of that in order to be able to participate meaningfully in the social world? What are the consequences or what are the resources that you would need to be able to have access to in order for that to happen? So this tension between absolute and relative measures had a really significant influence on how we think about class and how we think about poverty more generally. ACOS, so this is the Australian Council of Social Services, so this is a peak body that represents welfare agencies across Australia for, I think it's 20 or 30 years now, has been releasing every few years a report on poverty in Australia that very much continues this tradition of trying to figure out, from a relative poverty perspective, around poverty lines and median incomes and the rest of it, to develop a snapshot or to tell a story about what it means to live in poverty in a wealthy country. And you'll notice here that this report came from 2020, but there's always a bit of lag between when these statistics are developed and then when they get reported and the rest of it. So we're using data from 2017, 2018, but again, this is relevant for what we're talking about here. So this is a snapshot of poverty in Australia. And what it tells us is that, so it picks up on what we've talked about a moment ago. So it establishes a poverty line, so 50% of the median income before deducting housing costs. So for a single adult in Australia, that's $457 per week. For a couple with 2 children, it's $960, and then it's adjusted accordingly to the number of people in a particular household. I won't go through each one of these, but I just want to use this to flesh out this idea of how Australia understands social welfare and systems of incentives and disincentives as well. So the third dot point, the second one tells us that there are 3.24 million people, 13.6% of the population, or over 1 in 8, are estimated to be living below the poverty line after taking account of their housing costs. 774,000 children under the age of 15 are also living in this category of living below the poverty line. But it's the social security dot point, so it's the 1, 2, 3. The fifth dot point down that I think is also important, that connects back to what we were talking about a moment ago. Sorry, I've got the world's squeakiest chair. And what this points to is this idea, as we said, that social support and income support is not enough in our society to get somebody out of poverty. So the expectation, if you filter it through that history of deserving and undeserving, of incentives and disincentives, the logic of this system is, while it often gets people close, there is a clear message that's being sent here, is that government support as your primary source of income will not be enough to get you out of that state of being. And that's sometimes a subtle, sometimes an explicit, sometimes a sort of a recurring theme in these discussions of class and disadvantage in Australia, but it's ever present. And as ACOS shows, by plotting this over time, sometimes we have improvement in these numbers, sometimes they descend or they plateau a little bit, but very rarely has there been moments of significant improvement. It's pretty much like we've set a baseline and we, Liberal or Labor, it sort of stays or hovers around those areas. And again, there's an attempt to locate this within a more global perspective. So poverty is definitely one way of thinking about class, and it's been, as I said, an interest in research to try to understand disadvantage and locate and zero in on particular groups and the struggles that they face in trying to eke out an existence, even within one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I think what we then saw from the late 1970s and 80s onward was a new language of class, and new ways of studying it begin to emerge. In a lot of ways, this is a shift from poverty to inequality. So what this does is it begins to emphasise a set of relational ideas. So access, opportunities, networks of support, and that these can be different for different people. Your ability to access these services and goods and services, again, will profoundly influence the way that you interact and engage with the social world more generally. I think an interest in inequality also opens up other opportunities for thinking about changes over time. So ACOS talks about shifts in poverty over time, but one of the difficulties or the limitations of that is that we're only getting an account of people located at one end of the spectrum. And what's happening at the other end? How does disadvantage relate to privilege, wealth versus poverty? It's those contrasts that make for an interesting discussion, but also tell us a lot about the experience of living in a class-based society. And I think one of the key distinctions that a lot of researchers then begun to make, and this is something that Bourdieu talked about last week in a more conceptual sense, is a distinction between income, so wages, salaries, and wealth, assets, and investments. So I just want to start to wrap this up just by pointing to additional data that comes out of a different stream of ACOS's research output. This is research that they do in conjunction with a number of welfare agencies and universities across the country to flesh out and to develop a story of income and wealth distribution in Australia. So let me just dwell on this for a minute, because at first it might not be apparently or obvious what these two graphs are actually mapping. So these are colour-coded in order to pick up an experience of income and wealth distribution in Australia. So if you imagine this circle as being carved up into 5 equally sized categories, so the whole population is divided up into this 20% of the population versus this one, and this one. So you've got a group, 20% of the population in this model is blue, red, light blue, yellow, and green. So if income and wealth distribution was perfectly distributed or equally distributed across the society at large, what you would have is that circle with 5 equally sized segments of blue, red, light blue, yellow, and green. But what we see here is something quite different. And it's an important one, I think, to point to both what each of these is telling individually, but also the story they tell when we think of them together. So if we look at the distribution on the left-hand side, so this is about income. So income here is being understood as wages or salary. It's understood as the income that is derived from, say, investments or superannuation, or thirdly from social security payments. So if we divide up that total sort of income pie in Australia, we've got that highest, the 20%, so the green group here, controlling just under 40% of the income in this country. The yellow, so the next group along, down from the top, that 20% of the population controls 23%. The middle, the blue one, 17%, so it's sort of mapping. Red, second bottom, 20% controls 12%, and the lowest is 7.8% of that total income pie in Australia. And that's not a perfect picture by any score, but I guess there's a sense there that income distribution across the society, apart from that lowest 20%, there's a sense that at least for, say, 60% of the population, there's a sense that there is a bit of sort of income diversity. If we then shift to the focus of thinking about wealth distribution in Australia, so by wealth what we're talking about are houses, so how much your house is worth, superannuation, so your superannuation account, not the income that you might be deriving from it, but the actual balance of the account more generally. We've got shares or financial assets, investment properties, which in Australia is a big thing, and also sort of miscellaneous non-financial assets. So that might be cars or boats or artworks or whatever it is. This is telling a very different story. So here we've got that top highest 20% controlling more than 60% of those entire assets in terms of wealth. So if we grouped all the wealth in Australia up into that big pie, how then do we separate it out? So that top 20 controls 62%. The next group have 20% of it. The middle, so look at that drop, has 11. Second to last has 5, and the lowest 20% of the population control 0.6% of that total allocation of wealth in this country. In a lot of ways, I think this is capturing both, or continuing, but also reminding us of the unevenness of the social institutions or organisations that we live in. and the way that they are very much unequally distributed or allocated across our system. So again, if you think back to last week, so we've got Pierre Bourdieu making distinctions between different kinds of capital, and Bourdieu very much also tried to sort of break this idea apart as well by thinking of economic capital, but then thinking of the sort of cultural and social networks that allow wealth to move around or to be controlled by particular groups. We see something similar happening here and happening in Australia more generally, of these striking distributions of wealth. And think of this as also mapping opportunities, perhaps, about resources and the ability to invest or reinvest opportunities, to take advantage of things as they pop up. And controlling 0.6% of that wealth would put you in a fairly disadvantaged position in trying to act upon those chances, as I said, if they should pop up from time to time. That's taken us a long way around, but let's start to draw some of this together. So we've talked about social class, we've talked about some of the theoretical underpinnings of this idea and the different traditions that have told stories and given accounts of social class as an identity and as a set of relationships. Class, I think, points or offers a powerful insight into some aspects of social life, but it obscures others. So very much we've talked in a very general sense about people in Australia. We've equated income and wealth to people. We haven't taken into account sex or gender or age, ethnicity, religion, or whatever it might be. So again, that complexity needs to be added into the discussion as well. But even then, I think the shift in thinking of a focus on poverty and disadvantage and sort of zeroing in on one group of people toward thinking of it as coming out of a series of relationships has tremendous potential for showing us how the distribution of resources can profoundly impact on a person's sense of control and their ability to make meaningful changes about how they live their lives, where they work, where they live, how they engage with the society more generally. As I'll keep saying, that this becomes, so these are useful insights, but they become more useful as we add more variables into the mix. When we think about ideas like location, sex, gender, age, so on and so forth, as we progress through the coming weeks. Doing that allows us to then think back to ideas of class, but also about the differences in the way that we experience the world. I look forward to continuing the discussion next week. I'll see you then.